There has been a lot of media attention lately around sentencing from Jussie Smollett to Sherry Papini. As you will recall, Jussie Smollett was sentenced to 5 months in jail and ordered to pay $130,000 to the city of Chicago after being convicted on 5 counts of disorderly conduct. Now, Sherry Papini has pled guilty to lying to federal authorities about being kidnapped, and in a plea deal, she has agreed to pay $300,000 in restitution. And in exchange, prosecutors will recommend 8 months jail time for her. Today, we're asking, how do these cases and the sentences associated with each case, how do they stack up? We're talking to the experts and some folks who were directly involved with Jussie Smollett's case, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
You all will remember the case of Jussie Smollett. He was the actor from Empire that had a promising career. He was later charged and convicted with 5 counts of disorderly conduct after he reported to police that he had been attacked by 2 white men in the early morning of a cold day in January when he was walking down a street in Chicago. He claims that 2 white men wearing MAGA hats jumped him and put a noose around his neck. Jussie's allegations sparked a nationwide conversation about hate crimes, about punishment, about celebrity justice, and ultimately the role of judges in meting out punishment. A month ago at Jussie's sentencing hearing, the judge in this case excoriated him, calling him a charlatan pretending to be a victim of a hate crime. In fact, that judge called Jussie's conduct shameful. The judge ultimately sentenced him to 5 months in jail, but in less than a week, an Illinois appeals court granted Jussie's release pending his appeal. Jussie now is at home, and in fact, he is making new music. Now, contrast that with Sherry Papini. Sherry, as we know, also reported to the police that she had been the victim of a crime. In her case, she says 2 Latinx women kidnapped, branded her, abused her, and held her hostage for over 22 days. Now, Sherry ultimately admitted that she was lying about the attack and being abducted and kidnapped, and that she was actually at her ex-boyfriend's house during this entire 22 days when federal authorities and local authorities were expending untold amount of resources looking for her. So today we're looking at 2 different hoaxes, although Jussie claims that his was not a hoax, 2 different courts and 2 different sentences. What are we to make of these 2 cases? My first guest this morning knows a lot about Jussie Smollett's case because he was one of his criminal defense attorneys, and he has a practice in Chicago where he regularly practices criminal defense law. I'm glad to have him with me this morning. His name is Shay Allen. Good morning, Shay.
Good morning, Areva. How are you?
Great. Last time we talked, Jussie was behind bars, even though your team made a passionate plea during that sentencing hearing for him to remain free pending his appeal. That judge that excoriated Jussie said absolutely positively no. We saw Jussie handcuffed and we saw him walked out of that courtroom presumably he was walked into the Cook County jail where, according to that judge, he was to remain. But you were successful on appeal by filing your appeal and getting him released. Tell us, how were you able to work that magic and get him out in less than a week?
Sure. So we always knew that after the verdict, we were going to file an appeal in the appellate court. But there's a small avenue you can take that's rarely granted called an appeal bond. In essence, you can remain on bond until your appeal is completed. Now, I filed these before and they're rarely granted. We wanted to take that extreme measure in this case because we were sure we had valid issues on appeal. And then when we filed that appeal bond, we felt that once the appellate court had an idea of what our issues were during trial, that they would in fact grant that bond, and they did.
So as far as I can tell from some reports, Jussie is home, he's making new music, he's kind of going on with his life. Is that what's happening?
Absolutely, but he's also very involved and very concerned about the appeal. He understands that it's a process. It may take some time to get to the end point. He also understands if for some odd reason it doesn't go our way, that he will have to complete. It's a possibility that he may have to complete that sentence out, but the appellate court can also reduce the sentence as well.
So help us understand what you're seeking on appeal. Like, what's the best case scenario for Jussie if this appeal is granted?
Best case scenario is that the appellate court says that there were so many errors and so many things happened procedurally and legally wrong that they can reverse the jury's verdict and say, you know what, there's a finding of not guilty because Jussie's constitutional rights were so hindered that the verdict is taken away. Alternatively, there were so many mistakes and so something so wrong happened that we receive a new trial, which we will welcome as well.
Wow. Can you imagine if the appellate court does say we're going to basically throw out the verdict of the jury that convicted him and send it back to the trial court? Do you think the prosecutors in Chicago would try this case again, or would they just say, you know what, we've expended enough public resources on this. The guy did 6, 10, however many days in jail. Let's just call it quits, pay us our $130,000 and move on with your life.
Well, Areva, what you're saying, that makes logical sense, but this case doesn't make sense. I can imagine a scenario where the case comes back because in particular, the issue about the double jeopardy issue, that's a very, very clear issue in my mind. It's an issue that we've seen already dealt with in the Bill Cosby case. And I think that issue alone is enough to bring the case back. So I can't imagine a scenario, but I don't imagine a scenario where if the case comes back, the prosecutors will say, you know what, let's do the right thing here and save the taxpayers' money. This has gone on long enough and dismiss it. I think they will come guns blazing.
Wow. And you're probably not too far from the truth. What you're saying is because I know there's been a tremendous outrage from the Chicago law enforcement community with respect to even him being released pending the appeal. How does all of this national spotlight on this case, how is it impacting you as a lawyer in terms of how you're doing your job and then ultimately your client?
Yeah, from the beginning, I think Jussie was prepared to deal with the scrutiny because there were a lot of factors that I thought that would put more of a focus on him in this particular case. Outside of his celebrity status, I think that because he's a Black male, he's a gay Black male, and he's also a proud man. I think that you combine those three factors, and I think many people in this country, unfortunately, if it's not one of those three, they despise. All three together makes just a big pot of hate. So I knew it was coming, but me as an attorney, it hasn't affected me. I've always, dealt with adversity over my life. You see these things, and especially in Chicago can be a tough city. So you build a thick skin.
Yeah, I'm going to respect the jury's verdict, but I can tell you, I was just sick in my stomach listening to that judge excoriate Jussie in the way that he did. Whether you think he's innocent or not, it felt like one of those tongue lashings, all but called him an uppity N-word. It just felt so white supremacist to me. I literally was sick. I was like sickened. I was sick. And I had to jump on TV and radio and talk about it, but it was something. I don't know if I've ever witnessed a white judge dress down a Black defendant in that way on national television. Now, sure, it happens a lot inside courtrooms when the cameras aren't glaring, but to do that, knowing that it would be broadcast out to the world was rather bold on the part of that judge. And I felt so inappropriate, well beyond the bounds of what we typically hear when a judge is telling a defendant why I'm going to give you a particular sentence. But let's talk about that, Shay, because, there is a huge portion of the population that thinks that Jussie did this. The jury obviously thought that he did it and thinks that he should just say he's sorry and go on a mea culpa tour and just kind of, move on. We know the public has a short attention span and we're very forgiving of our celebrities. We hold them in high regard. And when folks say, hey, I made a mistake, people tend to forgive them. I know you maintain that that's not what Jussie's going to do, right?
Oh, absolutely not, because Jussie has maintained his innocence and continues to do so. So there's no reason for an apology tour for something you didn't do. And I always make it clear to all my clients, if this is something you didn't do, you should not apologize for it. You should not plead guilty to it. And, we're going to fight it as far as we can. So that's definitely what's happening here. He's maintaining his innocence. Absolutely.
Okay, and I get that. And as a lawyer, obviously, you have to respect that. And if your client tells you they didn't do something, that is absolutely your ethical obligation to do and to say exactly what you did. But there are some nuances, right? And there's some gray lines here. So your client could apologize not for making up what he said happened to him, but maybe creating confusion, maybe, creating this dramatic scene that is, brought so many folks into it. There's some things that could be apologized for that don't go to the heart of this matter. Has he considered that at all?
No, it's similar to if you make your partner upset and instead of apologizing for what you did, you tell your partner, I'm sorry you feel that way. So I think it's best for him to just stay quiet on the issue, let the appeal work itself out, and continue to work on his life, and then continue to look forward to a positive result in the appeal, because my grandma said a half apology is like no apology.
Yeah, there are people who feel that way, who definitely say just apologizing about how something makes you feel. But there are others, I think, in this community, particularly if you read the social media posts and follow the social media on this case, want to hear him stand up to something or make some kind of comment. And I understand that the appeal is pending. But what if you lose? What if the trial court says, well, there may have been some errors, but they're not reversible errors? That's going to be the dispositive finding that the court has to make. And he is remanded back to serve those 5 months. Do you think that will in any way soften his resolve about how he should move forward?
I don't think so. Jussie is a very resilient young man, and he has been through this process. So if you get to that unfortunate point and he does have to go finish out the sentence, which we have prepared him for, that's a possibility. I don't think that he would then go on an apology tour, especially at that point, because it's nothing else you can do.
Yeah. How did you feel? I just want to get your feelings or your thoughts about, how were you feeling as you heard that judge, say those horrible, nasty things about Jussie the person, not necessarily the crime that he was convicted of? I just thought that's where the judge was crossing the line. Like, you don't know this young man in that way. So you're like way over with these comments.
Yeah. Quite frankly, I was appalled. I've worked in that courthouse for many years, and I've been through many cases, and I've never heard such a personal attack on a person's character and their person. And if it ever happens, it always upsets me, because you don't know this person intimately. You had a sentencing hearing. We do the best we can to bring in people to try to describe the person's overall character, but you don't know them. But it also bothered me as though the judge was chastising them about the gay community and the African-American community, that the judge can speak on, that Jussie has wronged them in some way. I don't know what gives him the authority to speak on these things, but the entire speech to me seemed it seemed like a production, and I wasn't pleased about that particular portion, along with many other portions.
And just finally, on the Sherry Papini case, do you see any similarities, any differences, anything that strikes you about her case? Obviously, she's admitted that she was never kidnapped or abducted, and that she created the whole story out of whole cloth.
For what I've seen, Ms. Papini has gotten more grace in regards to people's sentiment about it. I've read that the mayor of that particular town when she was kidnapped, even basically said that, people should, forgive her, that, she's done something wrong, but that she should receive grace. Those are not the reactions I've seen in regards to Mrs. Smollett. And I think it does come down, it comes down to race. Even in the search, the white woman syndrome, she was missing and the world stopped, go search for her. And so now the same, I think on the other end, you're getting the same reaction, even though she decided to plead guilty, that's fine. But the reaction seems to be, she's getting much more grace than Jussie ever got.
But do you think, Shay, in fairness, if Jussie had, and I know you maintain he didn't do it, but had he made some kind of, concession, apology, or something, that he would have received a similar level of grace that you just described? Do you think it would have mattered?
I don't think so. I think people from the beginning, even before anyone claimed to know what happened in the case, people were in the beginning saying, I never believed it anyway. And so we're waiting for a moment to pounce. So I think even if he did apologize, people would have said, oh, too little, too late. You get what you deserve, and those sorts of things, different from what Ms. Papini's getting.
Interesting. Well, we'll definitely continue to follow this. When do you think you'll hear from the appellate court in terms of what their final, I guess they're going to have to schedule some oral arguments. You haven't even had those, right?
No, we have to brief the issues. I think it's going to be a while before an oral argument comes, probably several months.
Okay, so no closure to this, at least probably for months to come.
No, I don't expect that. But I've been wrong before, so you never know.
Well, this court moved pretty quickly in letting him out, so we'll see what happens. But we'll continue to follow the case. We'll definitely have you back after we hear more from that appellate court in terms of how they're going to resolve this matter. But thank you so much, Shay, for sitting down with me this morning. All right, my next guest is Tony Thetford. He is a criminal defense attorney in Chicago, and he's familiar with the Smollett case and similar cases. Good morning, Tony, and welcome.
I apologize. Good morning, Areva. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no problem. Glad to have you here. Wanted to talk to you. You're not one of the lawyers, so you're much more objective in terms of what you saw in this case. So how does Jussie's case compare to others that you've seen handled in Chicago courtrooms when there have been allegations of lying to the police?
Well, let me first of all say that I'm not on the case, but I'm very good friends with your last guest, Shay. So, yeah, I think, and I spoke about this before when I was on with you. I felt the remarks were over the line. Again, I agree with Mr. Allen. I know this judge and have practiced in front of him for years. I thought that went too far, and it implied many of the things that you just indicated, that it was about race, that it was about an uppity Negro, that it was those kind of tropes. So I thought it was a misstep.
So you've been before this judge before, and you've heard him give out sentences, and you've never seen him get as personal as we witnessed him get with respect to Jussie's case.
Well, I have not. I mean, but what he did was not outside of this judge's reputation. He does get involved a lot of times with those sort of speeches. So I think that it's unfair to say that he isolated Jussie. I think, though, that the words that he used implied other things. And I think that is really the issue. I think a judge has a right, because they speak as a conscience of the community during a sentencing, to sort of lecture a client. But again, those words were I think in this day and age, not appropriate.
Tone deaf, at the very least. They were tone deaf, right? I'm glad you mentioned in this age where we're having these conversations about race and structural racism, you would think that a judge would be more discerning about his choices of words. Let's talk about Sherry Papini's case, though. So here you have a white woman, opposite part of the country, makes up this, claim that she was abducted by Latin women, Hispanic women, that she was tortured and, chained to a bed and branded, hair shed. I mean, this is an elaborate story that she makes up, only to then come forward and say, sorry, big lie, I was at my ex-boyfriend's house. she pleads guilty immediately, and there's this plea deal. So the plea deal is supposed to have her pay $300,000 in restitution and a recommendation of sentencing of about 8 to 12 months or so, even though her charges, federal charges, carry up to 20 years. Do you think this case, is that the right plea deal, the right recommendation from the prosecutors?
Well, if you look at it, she went in early and pled as soon as she was indicted. So again, as you indicated, this deal was in the works, and that's not atypical in a federal case, particularly for an offense that occurred 6 years ago. So it looked to me like they were getting close to the statute of limitations on any sort of charges against her. And so they needed to wrap it up. So in a practical sense, this is not uncommon in my experience in federal court in terms of how things sort of proceed with these kind of early pleas. Now, as to her case, I think the context is a bit different from Mrs. Smollett's case, although the actions are similar in terms of the prosecuting authority is different, in terms of the politics involved, completely different. When you have federal authorities, they're not looking to be reelected. When you have a state court case, you have, judges who may grandstand because they've got to answer to the voters. And if the community is outraged, then, maybe they, add to that sort of voice. So again, there are some major differences, I believe, with Papini's case in terms of how it's being prosecuted. 8 months or any jail time for a person with zero background is significant. And I think I said that to you before when we were talking about Jussie the last time we spoke. So again, I don't really do math in terms of she should get more. She should be punished, and she is being punished. If you note with her sort of statements or a plea agreement, she will be paying for this for the rest of her life. This will be a felony conviction, and she will be prevented from participating in society the same way that she did before the conviction. So again, she is being punished. I hope that is sufficient so that this won't affect that community again. And that community and her family are the true victims here.
Why do you think, Tony, we're not talking about her case in terms of being a hate crime? And I know there are differences. Obviously, in Jussie Smollett's case, he alleged that there was the MAGA hat, that there were actually some, racially, charged words used during the attack that he alleges. In this case, you are talking about a white woman who says two Hispanic women. So I don't know why she described them as Hispanic. If you're making the story up, I don't know why in your story they were Latin women and not just, white women, which, seems to, again, be some kind of undertone trying to discredit or, cast aspersions on Latin people. So I don't hear a lot of talk about that. Why do you think that is?
Well, Areva, it's more than an undertone. This has happened before, where a white woman has committed a crime or has gone missing and has blamed it on people of color. It's happened before. So again, this is an old sort of routine that's used in order to get credibility. Remember this, she was relying on law enforcement and those people listening to her to react to the brown people who had kidnapped her. So she needed that part in order to give the story viability and credibility. So it says a lot, not only about her, but about the community that received that information and bought it, at least for a certain amount of time. So again, justice has prevailed. FBI has done their investigation and we've gotten to the truth. So I'll be clear about that. So it's not as if law enforcement failed to act, but she needed that in order to keep the dogs away. And similarly though, Areva, I think it's fair to argue that Mrs. Smollett also used a trope in order to get people to believe him. He used and we don't often defend, white men in this context, but he used race and he used right-wing politics, which implied that the white men were racist. And then he, again, used the allegations that racist tropes were used. Again, he has maintained his innocence, so he's in a different position than Ms. Papini, who's admitted to these things. But in terms of the jury's verdict for Mr. Smollett, they found that he, in fact, used the same behavior in order to justify the crime that he says was committed against him, or to validate, rather, his story about the crime that he says was committed against him. So there are some connective tissue between the two cases.
And you're right. And by using the MAGA hat and some of the inflammatory language, particularly during that period, January 19th, Trump is still in office, he knew that that would get the attention, which it did, of mainstream national media, and the story became a national story. But there has been lots of talk about hate crime associated with his story that he maintains, as you said, is true. In her case, I'm not hearing that same, we're not talking about the fact that she is using Latinx women as a way, as you just said, to validate her story, to get the attention of the law enforcement community, to cause her story to be more believable, because it plays into the trope that, yeah, black and brown people are dangerous and they do horrible things to white women and they're not safe. White women are not safe, if black and brown people are around them. We're not hearing that. I mean, that is not the lead in this story. And to Shay's point about grace, now there are differences. She pled guilty, so you could say, yes, anytime you plead guilty, you're taking a punishment, we should forgive you. He says, even if Jussie said, I did it, he doesn't think he would be forgiven. What do you agree with Shay on that point?
I agree with Shay on that point. Shay is advocating for his client, but objectively, a person who pleads guilty should be treated differently from a person who maintains their innocence at that point. He has an absolute right and should maintain his innocence if he continues to stand on that innocence. But there are consequences to that. And again, he went through a jury trial process, was found guilty by citizens of Cook County, and he was punished as such. I do believe that his punishment was severe. As I've said to you before, I think that he should not have gotten a minute in jail, but nonetheless.
But wait a minute, if you think his punishment is severe, do you think Papini should serve any time in jail? The prosecutors are recommending 8 months. Do you think she too should just pay restitution and move on with her life?
No, I think that Ms. Papini's case was far more protracted. If you remember, Jussie Smollett's case was he was punished based on a plea agreement. And in that plea agreement, his case was then dismissed. So he also took responsibility on the front end. So the way this worked here.
He plead no contest. He didn't plead guilty, right? He pled no contest?
He pled no contest on a deferment deal. So as a prosecutor, it's a deferred sort of prosecution sentence. So he doesn't plead guilty, but he had resolved the case. Mm-hmm. And so again, his case was reawakened based on public outrage. Her case was different. It took a more common route with a very long investigation that resulted in this. I think you take into consideration in Ms. Papini's case, the sentencing guidelines. The federal sentencing guidelines are far more strict for a felony offense for which she's charged, as opposed to the offense for which Mrs. Smollett was charged, which was a very low grade felony. Lying to a federal official is a 5-year maximum. Mail fraud is a 20-year. This was serious offenses.
Yeah,
Mrs. Smollett was never looking at that kind of time. Yeah, and his worst thing was never looking at that kind of time. So I think that the distinction there is fair. Based on how she was charged, what she was charged with, and the course of those cases and how they took different routes in terms of arriving at their arrival point.
But having this discussion now, Tony, about criminal justice reform, reimagining our criminal justice system, are these kind of low-level, non-violent crimes? Do you think people should be going to jail, period, whether it's under the federal sentencing guidelines or under state guidelines like Jussie? Because it does raise the question, do we want people in jail for telling lies? And maybe we do, I don't know, but you do this for a living. What do you think we should be doing if we're trying to reduce incarceration? Are these the kind of people we want at home, maybe with an ankle bracelet? Maybe we want them in the community doing community service. Are there other kinds of sentencing that we should be thinking about rather than sticking them in a jail cell?
Absolutely. In these two cases, the similarities are, again, they told lies. Allegedly for Mrs. Smollett, he was found guilty of that, and Ms. Papini said that she lied. In both cases, the victim in the case was actually the governmental administration that had to expend funds in order to follow up on their claims. So in order to resolve that, the best way to resolve that is have them pay the money back. What does it do to put either one of them in custody for any amount of time? In Ms. Papini's case, and as with many of my clients, she needs the opportunity to get back out and work. If she's agreed to pay the amount that she's paid, she needs to work in order to do that. Same thing with Mr. Smollett. He needs to pay these dollars back. Well, he needs to be able to work in order to do that. These jail sentences are just for punitive measures only, and they're intended to teach a lesson that's never taught. So instead of dealing with the problem, which is the expenditure of resources, we make it more difficult for the person that we've now jailed to actually make us whole. So I think that it is actually illogical and nonsensical to give jail time in these instances. And again, for the broader picture, as you discussed, these low-level nonviolent offenses, jail should be the rarest of occasions. And they fall in that category.
Yeah, it's complicated though, right, Tony? Because both, let's assume Jussie Smollett is the rich, famous actor that people believe him to be. We don't know what's in his bank account, but let's assume, from some of those reports, he was making, several $1 million an episode on Empire. And Miss Papini doesn't appear to be some poor woman herself. So if rich people, though, can pay the restitution and avoid jail sentences, we've got to make sure that the poor person, right, that may do the same things, be convicted, charged, etc., don't find themselves penalized in a different way because of their poverty or because of their inability to pay. So maybe Jussie goes into a bank account and pays his $130. Maybe Miss Papini goes to her husband or in-law or whatever and writes a check for $300. We know poor people don't have that luxury. So I don't expect you to answer it. I know you have to leave. It's just kind of my rhetorical thinking about this. I'll have to have you back and we can talk about this because it does get complicated. I agree with you. Jail doesn't seem to be the answer, but nor do we want there to be differences that benefit and advantage wealthy people over poor people, because we know the majority of people in these situations are neither celebrity or white, middle class, upper class women. So they're poor people.
Bring me back. We can talk about this forever because I 100% agree with you. And we can go on and on about this. I'll just wait for you to call me again.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Have a good day. Appreciate you sitting down with me. All right, so I have the perfect woman to finish this conversation with. Her name is Christy Plunkett-Smith. She's a statewide campaign manager for Smart Justice with the ACLU of North Carolina. She is a returning guest to the special report and a go-to person on these criminal justice issues. Good morning, Christy, and thanks again for joining me to help us wrap our brains around both of these cases and just what's happening on a national level as we were having conversations about reimagining policing, reimagining our criminal justice system. Those conversations have taken pretty much a back seat as these rising crime narratives that get played out every day on national TV have really dominated the conversation. So when you look at these cases, what do you think the punishment should be, given both of these individuals have some degree of wealth and status in our society?
I think the way that we address these issues is through what your last guest described, which is the repayment of the resources that were expended during this time. If somebody steals $20 from me, I don't want them to be locked up. I want my $20 back. But I don't just want my $20 back, Areva. I want to go a step further. I want to work with that person to ensure that they no longer have to steal $20 ever again, not from me, not from you, and that we change the harm that exists in the world today. And we're not doing that right now. What we're doing is we're putting people in cages that are in pain, and we're pushing pause on their lives. And when they get out, we push play again. And so their pain and their trauma just picks up where they left off. And it's really worse because now they are even more disconnected from resources, when what led them to that cage was the lack of resources for the most part. Now we're talking about people who lack resources for the most part, but even affluent people, if they might have lots of resources, but external things cannot fill an internal void. And so again, we are still talking about people who need something, who need maybe therapy, might need to see somebody, but they still have a need that is not being met. And the only way that we try to address unmet needs in this society is through locking them up.
Yeah, what we know about, it's been reported about Sherry Papini's case, is that she does have a history of making up stories. And many people have come forward who have said, yeah, I'm not really all that surprised because she has something going on where this is a pattern. So in terms of, as you say, therapy, mental health issues, something's going on with this woman that would cause her to do that. She left her kids and her husband and what appeared to be, at least to the outsiders, a very stable marriage and family life, to go on this 22-day excursion, you'll call it, with this ex-boyfriend and create this huge.
That is not someone who is well. That is someone who is unwell. And our response, again, to people who are not well in our communities, regardless of where that unwellness stems from, we tend to place them in a cage and call it care and expect them to get better with no resources, with dehumanization, disconnection. To your point about the way that Jussie Smollett was addressed in that courtroom, I mean, he was already found, had to plead guilty or no contest, take responsibility for something that he denies ever doing, and then to be dressed down in public in that way on national television. That's very traumatic. I mean, that just increased the trauma. So if the judge's intention was for Jussie to not do this again, I don't say that he may not have gotten what he wanted, because at the end of the day, you don't inspire people to make changes through shame and guilt. Shame and guilt is what keeps people down. It is what keeps people acting in their same pathology. And if we want to disrupt the behaviors, then we have to disrupt what people are telling themselves. He already feels horrible about himself and his situation. And so just piling on doesn't do anything to get him to where we want him to be, which is a healthy, whole, productive resident of this country.
Yeah. And what are you guys doing at the ACLU to really, I mean, you have the Smart Justice campaign. What is the goal of that campaign as you think about the criminal justice system?
So the Campaign for Smart Justice is a historic campaign that the ACLU launched nationwide back in 2014. And it has two top line goals that have been the top line goals since I've been working at the ACLU, which is to decarcerate the country by half. That means cut the prison population in half. Both at the state and federal level, as well as to challenge the racism that we know exists in the system, because Areva, the systemic racism, is evident at every stage of the system. So you have the police, which we know is full of racism, but we also have prosecutorial decisions, pretrial release decisions, sentencing. And once you go to prison, how you are disciplined by correctional officers is often worse if you are a Black person who is serving time. Even the resources that you have made available to you when you do come home and re-enter society, all of those things are impacted by systemic racism. And so since its launch, the Campaign for Smart Justice has worked to successfully pass more than 300 laws and policies in dozens of states. We've mobilized tens of thousands of people, working closely with hundreds of allies on the left and the right. We've launched voter education across the nation, and we really work on transforming mass incarceration by disrupting bail practices, disrupting parole practices, disrupting prosecutorial decision practices and sentencing. And we also are looking to work with folks who are re-entering, like myself, who 13 years ago re-entered into community after incarceration, and help people really build their lives so that we can have more Christy Puckett Williams in the world, so that we can have more people who are operating outside and in spite of their trauma and working inside their power.
I'm so glad you said Christy Puckett Williams, because I called you Smith.
It's okay.
Why I did that, so I want to correct that, Miss Williams.
No, you're fine.
Faux pas, because you and I have talked a million times.
Yeah, it's okay.
Let me ask you this, Christy.
Mm-hmm.
In LA right now, we have this mayoral race that's coming up in June, and it's becoming a race about crime, because we've had some high-profile crimes that have happened in the city of Los Angeles. And there was an article that came out last night. There was an 82-year-old woman. Her name is Jackie Avant. She's married to Clarence Avant, very high-profile philanthropist in this community. Clarence was a big record executive before he retired. Horrible death. Someone breaks into these elderly people's home in the middle of the night. The guy shoots Miss Avon in the back, shoots the security guard, kills her, leaves that location, goes to a second location, doesn't successfully rob them, goes to a second location to commit another robbery, is eventually caught. He now has pled guilty. Our prosecutor that was elected under the reform, rubric that was very popular just 6, 7, 8 months ago, has decided he's not going to charge special circumstances, and that means no death penalty, essentially.
Yeah.
He is charging him with crimes that would cause him to have to serve pretty much life in prison without opportunity for parole, although it's not called life without opportunity for parole. So a report comes out in the news that this guy, this hardened criminal who had just been released, has been in and out of jail since 12, is on the phone bragging to a woman that he killed this elderly woman. He's African American, she's African American, and he's not going to get the death penalty. And as you can imagine, that has incensed the community. And even before this, there have been efforts to recall this district attorney because they say he's too, quote unquote, soft on criminals and criminals like this one in particular. So how do we get to criminal reform when stories like that, so much attention at the local level and the national level, and they are heartbreaking? I mean,
Yes.
Jackie's like a jewel. She was like just a jewel in this community. People love her. They love her family, and everybody was just heartbroken to hear that you could be asleep, in this this gated, affluent community, and some person breaks in and kills her. And now he's in a jail cell, caught in a tape, bragging about killing her, and then going to another house to do the same thing. How do we cut through that and have reform?
So you have to, number one, you have to see people, have a radical love for people, number one. And it starts with unconditional positive regard for people. And that means no matter what people have done, that you hold them in a positive regard, because we understand that people are more than the worst thing that they've ever done. You are seeing a snapshot of this person, several snapshots of this person's life. But what you're not seeing is what happens to a child that grows to be an adult that believes that it's okay to rob and to take away from people. So there was something that happened in his life where those actions were acceptable. Those behaviors were acceptable. There's a community that we allow to exist in this country that bred a son that would act in this way. And so this is less about this individual act and more about our collective community. What do we do when people act up in our community? Do we respond in the same harm in which they responded? Because does that eye for an eye, does it really make it equal? Because is this lady coming back? I'm sorry she's gone, but him being put to death is not going to bring her back. So now you have two people who are put to death, two people who are no longer in this world. One doesn't equal out the other. It doesn't resolve her family's pain. Her family, despite this man, if he is put on death row, they will still have to deal with the fact that their mother, their loved one, was gunned down in cold blood. And his blood doesn't erase that. It just doesn't. And so the way that you...
Chrissy, I understand what you're saying is completely rational and logical, but what we know happens is when politicians like the one in this case, the Republican that is posing as a Democrat, who's a billionaire developer, is playing to those fears.
Sure. They should be afraid of white people then. If they are really afraid, they should be afraid of white people who are underrepresented in the system, who are overrepresented in our population, and who don't get the same amount of sentences that Black people get. And so if you look at death row, if you look at life without parole, white people are underrepresented in those populations. And so what that would have you believe is that white people don't engage in these behaviors, but that's not true, Areva. So what are we doing for white folks that act up? Let's do the same thing for the Black people who act up. That's all I'm suggesting, that we already have the tools that we need to adjust for whiteness. We need to make sure that our tools are adjusting for Blackness in this country as well, because it already does a good job of making sure that white folks who engage in bad behaviors don't have the most punitive sentences, don't have the most punitive, experiences of the system. So why is that? Why do Black people who represent less of the people have to receive the most punitive? And so that I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that a person killing someone is okay. That is not okay.
That's not even the conversation we're having. I'm just trying to understand, how do we change the mentality that Americans have? Because
we have to acknowledge the harm of our own self.
Let me just say that the go-to when you have a high-profile crime like that is we don't need progressive prosecutors. We need tough law and order. That we need more police on the street. We need tougher prosecutors. We need people who are going to throw the key.
We did that.
Put the person in jail and lock them up and throw away the key. And
we did that, and we doing that.
I know we've done it for years and years. And haven't changed anything, but that becomes the default that people fall back on.
I guess what I'm saying is, if that's what you think is going to get you to safety, you can keep doing the same thing over and over again. What they told me when in the rooms of recovery, that's insanity, to keep doing the same thing and over again, expecting a different result. What I'm suggesting is, if we want to get to community safety, then we have to do something different. And if it cannot be, the default cannot be to lock folks up. And we have to find another default. How do we resource people? Because think about this: if the $200 or $300 a day that this person, that the county the LA County Jail spends to house this person. If we gave that person $200 or $300 a day, you think they robbing your people? You think they breaking houses robbing? Probably not. And so we are willing.
But are you all, as the ACLU, are you breaking through with that message? That's what I'm trying to understand. How are we, as a nation, going to break through with your message? And I want to know,
we're building power.
You're doing that at your level in North Carolina.
We are building power. We have had, last year, we were able to secure the release through a lawsuit against the prison, over 6,000 people because of the conditions of the prison, right? And so we are constantly pushing for the better treatment of people, for the conditions of prison to be humane, and for people to be released. Because what we do know is that we are not allowing people to recognize their full potential when we stifle and stymie their growth inside of a jail cell, inside of a prison cell. And so if you want people to be and act better, then we have to give them the conditions to do so. And all we're suggesting is that people who are in prisons, in the way in which they are currently run, they are not getting better. They are in fact getting worse. And they are proving my point. What you just described, this man has been in and out of the system a lot of times. Now the system, when he entered the first time, he probably wasn't hardened. But now that he's been through that system several times, now he's hardened. Now his humanity has been so disconnected and disappeared from him that a heinous crime of killing an 82-year-old elder doesn't even prick his conscience. But he learned not to have a conscience inside of that same prison that we put him in. And so you can't really blame him for being a product of the environment that we created for him. And so if we want to see things different, we the people have to do things different if we want things to be different. We can't just keep putting the onus on the system, on its actors, and on the people who are the most marginalized. It really is a measure of who we are as a society, how we treat incarcerated people and how we treat each other. Because how we treat each other leads to incarceration. People don't get locked up because they're treating themselves or each other well. We treat each other bad on a day-to-day basis, and some of us end up in a jail cell.
Yeah, and what I'm asking you is how are you as an organization, you being the ACLU, breaking through with that message? Because some polling came out with respect to our mayoral race, and crime was amongst the top issues that people had. And this candidate whose suggestion to deal with crime was to increase our police department by 1,500 officers, that candidate leaped ahead of the candidate who's been in the community working for decades on police reform and then, reimagining our criminal justice system. Congresswoman Karen Bass, she was actually the one of the lead authors of the George Floyd reform bill that got stalled in Congress at the federal level. So that message of we make streets safer by putting more cops and locking up hardened criminals for indefinite periods of time still resonates. And not just with Republican voters or independent voters. This is resonating with hardcore liberal Democratic voters in Los Angeles. Right. So I'm just trying to understand how is your organization helping to reach those people, those Dems that should be solidly behind this Democratic candidate who have decided that, I don't know, I like her, but this guy over here, I want those 1,500 cops. I want that harsher penalty.
Well, we have to call them out for their reliance and dependence upon white supremacy. They benefit from that white supremacy. And so when you are a benefactor of white supremacy, of course, you want to maintain the status quo. And so we have to challenge people to think about, we do a lot of education, public education. We do a lot of working with people who are currently incarcerated to talk about what they're experiencing and who they are. We have to humanize people. That's really the work that we're doing, is that I'm not just a number inside of a system, that I am a person, that I had a story that led me into the doors of that prison, that as a victim of severe domestic violence, the system's response was to lock me up as a victim of violence. And so those are the kinds of stories that we have to tell that are rooted in the real experiences of people who have survived that system and who have thrived post that system. But we also have a real responsibility to center the voices, and this is what we try to do at the ACLU, of the people who are currently embroiled in that system and their families. And we also, as a victim, I'm a victim of violence, I also work with victims to help them understand how do we truly get to safety, because really, police is an illusion of safety. The police show up after everything has happened.
Crime is over.
They're not coming when the crime is happening. And we have seen, what did we see in Florida in the Parkland shooting? That the security guard ran and hid and left them kids out there to get shot. And so, at the end of the day, we have to have critical thinking And I always say that critical thinking is the greatest threat to white supremacy. And what you see is a lot of lazy politicians saying a lot of lazy things. You got a lot of lazy voters who are just going with, like you said, the default. My job is to create a system that is an alternative, that is a better system, that is reimagined. And I am working every day to recreate a system that actually works, that is unfettered and unmolested by white supremacy, that allows Black people to thrive, allows our culture to thrive, because so much of our lives have been criminalized, so much of our existence, how we talk, how we look, how we just stand, just standing at the corner store is vagrancy and loitering. Just our very existence has been criminalized. And so a lot of the work that we do at the ACLU is to reorient the community to the way in which the carceral state has been allowed to thrive, despite the Constitution, despite the amendments, that the carceral state is the biggest threat to our democracy.
How much of that work are you all doing nationwide, Chrissy? Because, in the midterm elections that are coming up,
yes,
this issue of crime is, a part of the culture wars that we see
yes,
being played out. And we saw some elections, like the New York mayor, Eric Adams, he leaned into crime. And some think that it was because of his leaning into that kind of law and order as a former cop, that was one of the reasons he was successful. So is this education that you just described happening across the country? And are you gearing up for how to counter these arguments that are going to be used in midterm elections across this country that could cause a huge shift in the national landscape in terms of the Congress and the Senate, and eventually maybe even the White House? And we could see every piece of reform, every effort, every conversation literally just wiped away.
So yes, so as a national organization, ACLU is working across the country. We work an integrated advocacy model, which means we have organizers and activists on the street like myself and in the community. And we also have folks at the legislature working. I'm also a lobbyist. I work at the legislature here in North Carolina. And we also have litigators who are constantly looking to file lawsuits and do things. And so we do a lot of that across the country. But we also here in the South, I believe that if you change the South, you change the nation. So we do a lot of work around civil rights here in the South with our Southern collective. We have a partnership of the 12 Southern states. We're partnering with Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign to mobilize on June 18th to DC, so we can demand that Black folks and poor people are centered. And we do engage in races. In Wake County here in North Carolina, there's a progressive prosecutor race happening. We are engaging in that race, dropping money into that race. There's other races that the ACLU is engaging in across the country to try to influence and to shift in ways that mark what our members and our supporters say they really want to see. And so we really want to educate folks so that our issues, priority issues, are voted on in that ballot box across the country. And I think we're rolling out things, early voting here in North Carolina starts soon. And so you should be seeing lots of mailers and different things come out. And hopefully through our digital ads and through Facebook and all the social media, that we will have more informed voters who are able to read between the lines of just the headlines, but can really get to the point of, if you continue to lock everybody up, we have 4 times more people than China in this country. I mean, China has 4 times more people than we do, right? Their population is 4 times that amount. We have double their prison population. So we have 2.2 million people and they have 1.6. Like, why do we have more incarcerated people than people in China, right? And it's because our attitude towards each other has been marred by white supremacy in such a way that we are disconnected. And our work is about connectivity and not disconnectivity. And we're trying to innovate so that in 2024, not just these midterms, Areva, I have to signal for you that democracy is at risk in 2024. I mean, yes, we got to get through the midterms, but Lord Jesus, we don't know what 2024 is going to hold. So we're also holding space right now, but looking at a much forward focus on building power around saving our democracy.
Well, thank you for reassuring me that the ACLU, amongst other organizations, Reverend Barber, I've had him on the show too, as well as his partner. There's so much work to be done, and you're right. This is not just about the midterm elections. It's about 2024. It's about our entire democracy. It's about the Capitol and this, this criminal justice system, this penal system that is, a moneymaker. Let's call it what it is. And incarcerating people of color has become a way to generate huge revenues, not just for private companies, but for governmental entities, counties and states and federal government. So there's money in crime, unfortunately. Yeah. There's money in incarceration, unfortunately, and dismantling those systems requires us to, take profits away from some of these people who are benefiting, and we got to call that out too. Thank you so much, Christy.
Thank you for having me.
Christy Puckett Williams.
Thank you, Areva Martin,
Always
so
good
much.
to sit down with you. I just love your energy, and I love what you guys are doing in North Carolina, and we need to see more of it across the country because we are in a fight. We are
Yes,
in
we
a
are.
battle, and I think we can win. We got to stay optimistic, but we've got to stay so diligent because the forces fighting against us, and some of them are coming from within our own communities, in our own circles. So we
Yes,
got to
ma'am.
be diligent about those as well. But with you on the case, I'm more inspired and encouraged than ever. So be
Thank you
well,
so
my
much.
friend. We'll talk soon, of course, because this topic is not going away. All right, I want to thank Christy and thank Shay and Tony and my guests this morning, all of them providing such insightful information about not only Jussie Smollett's case and Sherry Papini. Those are cases that obviously are being talked about in the media, but there are people every day in this country who are charged with low-level nonviolent crimes. And 6 months ago, we were talking about how we reimagine our criminal justice system so we weren't just throwing those people into jail and spending endless amounts of taxpayers' dollars to house these individuals and creating more prisons and more jails and warehousing more people. We were talking about putting money into community services, into health and human services, and making sure people had mental health services. We were talking about gang intervention, and we were talking about all of those interventions that stop people from committing crime on the front end. Sadly, those conversations have pretty much disappeared from the national landscape, but it's our job. It's our job, each and every one of us, to continue to remind our elected officials, our policymakers, that the answer to this question of whatever crime spikes we may be seeing is not more cops and more prisons. We have been there before. As Christy said, the definition of insanity is to continue to do the same things over and over and over again and expect a different outcome. There will not be a different outcome. We can put 1,500, 2,500, 5,000 cops on the streets of Los Angeles. We were told earlier in this week that there were 40,000 cops in the city of New York, yet we still saw what happened on that Brooklyn train. So cops are not the answer in isolation. Yes, police are needed in our community, and I'm not anti-police. I have lots of law enforcement friends, and I respect the law enforcement community, but if you've heard Cedric Alexander, veteran law enforcement professionals say that we need smarter policing, we need more technology in policing, we need more community policing. And until this country gets that, until we get that, we cannot lock ourselves up. We can't lock away people forever and think we're going to get out of this situation because people keep having more kids and those kids keep learning those same behaviors that they've witnessed in their communities. I have to believe we can get smart on crime and not just keep defaulting to this quote unquote tough on crime that the Republicans are pushing. So if you're in a local neighborhood and there's a race coming up, whether it's the mayor, the district attorney, the city council, really scrutinize any arguments that you're hearing about rising crime and the solution to that crime being more police officers. Ask those tough questions. Find out, how many police already exist in your community, how many crimes those police are solving, what kind of technology are they using, how much time are they putting into learning the community, and how many resources in your community are going into criminal crime prevention and intervention. Those are the smart questions you want to be asking. Those are my words to live by. Ask the smart questions. Okay, I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.